Every legacy begins with a voice. And here at the Runway Society, we're making these voices heard. We're talking not to the trendsetters, we're not just talking to the headliners, we're talking to the visionaries in the fashion industry. This podcast is not just a podcast, it is a cultural archive here to preserve the fashion industry and leave real legacy behind. I'm your host and creator, Michaela Leitz, and I'm inviting you to join us in this beautiful world of fashion. Welcome to another very exciting podcast episode on the Runway Society, the Paris edition. I have a very interesting guest today here. We have Peter Jeun Ho Tsang. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
You have to be here, that's why.
Exactly.
People need to hear more about what you're doing. Of course. So yeah, Peter, you are a true design futurist. You are someone whose work really stretches beyond trends and into systems. And you are the founder of Beyond Form, a venture studio supporting the next generation of fashion tech pioneers. You're also a trained designer, but especially a business strategist, which I find is so interesting how all of these pieces are coming together. And you are a very powerful voice in the conversation around circularity, but also innovation and what really the fashion industry needs to rewire itself from the inside, from deep within. And I've been following Peter already since a while, so I'm so excited to talk more with you today here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation.
When we talk about sustainability, you don't just talk about sustainability, you really talk about regeneration. So what does regeneration mean to you? You know, as a designer, as a builder, but also as a human living in this world?
No, absolutely. So for me, regeneration is going beyond the word sustainability, as you said. It's about how do we, as an industry, but also as a society, as humans, push the boundaries so that we can keep on renewing the systems that we use, that we live in, the world that we live in, the communities that we build. What does that mean specifically? If we're looking at fashion, the fashion industry, it's about how can we put in place systems that aren't necessarily about taking and making and then, disposing of fashion products, but it's about how do we build a system where that is about creating products that we can enjoy time and time again. My family come from the fashion industry as well. We created fashion products for big clients with our factories out in China.
Oh, wow.
And if we look at production as well, quite often here in the West, we forget about who makes our products and the livelihoods and the communities that help essentially to power the world in a nutshell. And if we obviously look at what's happening in America right now, that's a different conversation. But, where the factories were out in China, super important there in terms of how do we create a system to allow those people to keep on thriving and living and having this whole process and system in place for fashion. I think as well, if we look at fashion tech specifically, it's about how do we have technologies and teams and innovations that help to rewire a lot of what we already know and take for granted. So it could be a type of business, it could be a type of way of living, but then also how can we make it in a more restorative approach? And technology can help to do that, and hence why I actually shifted into the space.
Wow.
I was, as you mentioned in the introduction, I am a trained fashion designer and product developer. I had my own fashion brand, but I came to the epiphany that actually the world doesn't necessarily need more products in it. It needs more solutions to help us to enjoy fashion for a lot longer.
I love that. And as you just said, we don't necessarily need so much more fashion, but really like the quality in fashion to live in a world that's just not overproducing, but really providing value to this world. And honestly, who doesn't love fashion? Fashion is beautiful, but we have to make it a little bit more meaningful. And, also when we're thinking about the fashion industry is very stuck in old systems, I would say. And I know a lot of people agree with that. And on the other hand, fashion is also obsessed with the future. So what invisible habits or assumptions do you see holding the industry back from really tapping into the real future in fashion?
Yeah, I think this is like a paradox, really. When we think of fashion, we think of newness, we think of innovations, we think of trends. This is what the general public has as a perspective, as an outsider. But as we unveil behind the curtain, quite often is not, as you will know, being a consultant in the industry as well, it's a very traditional setup, shall we say. It's very linear in the way we're still thinking. As I said in my previous answer, it's still about taking, making, and then disposing, so creating waste with the products that we consume. And many fashion brands, well, to be honest, nearly all fashion brands are still working on that linear business model. Of course, even the ones that are doing more of the circular business models are still trying to conform within that linear system. So it's about how do we push beyond that? Again, industry is about thinking in short term. If we're thinking about very long, short cycles of the fashion industry, 6 months at a time or even faster, 12, like literally 7 days. For some fast fashion companies, it's a very quick turnaround. So it's that very short-term thinking that I think we need to get over. And with technology, even though inherent technology is very fast moving in terms of advancements, it can help to prolong those visions in terms of a long-term strategy and really build in value. I also think as well with fashion, we're still in this notion of growth at all costs. And obviously with this week's news of LVMH's sales dipping, of course now everyone's in panic mode because the sales have dipped. And this morning I was reading how Hermes's sales have slowed down as well. And it's this constant grow. And as soon as you falter with that growth statistic, it's kind of like, okay, something bad is going wrong with the industry. And it's this mindset that is very jarring, shall we say. We want to be sustainable, we want to be circular, we want to be all of these things, which is nice in, I guess, theory, but in practice, if the only mindset that we have is economical and growing at all costs, of course, quite often the making as much money as you can trumps over the other factors. And I think finally, because of all of that, we're still baking into the fashion industry legacy systems. And this is something that I talk about with my founders that I do work with in Beyond Form. It's about how do we overcome those legacy systems with technologies, with innovations. And I know we'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but I think for me, that's one of the most challenging things to overcome as somebody trying to work with new innovations.
100%. And I have some tea on LVMH.
Okay.
I've attended yesterday in Paris the shareholder meeting of LVMH. And Bernard Arnault also talked about the sales dip, but he sold it obviously a little different. And he talked about obviously the sales are dipping at the moment because their aspirational customer has less money to spend. So now they don't really see the sales dip that much at their very affluent customer because they're not as, they don't really have obviously the same financial problems that other people have at the moment. So they would like now to really concentrate a little bit more on the more affluent customer and how to serve them better. So on the one hand, it seems to be, interesting, but it's also nothing groundbreaking or new. I always have the feeling the industry is always going back and forth and serving the aspirational customer, then going back a little bit more to the more affluent one. So it is interesting. Let's see how this is going to work out for the next year. I will keep you all informed.
The viewers informed.
And viewers are informed. But also, Peter, you are such an interesting person because you work between design and venture, between people, but also product, between the today and the tomorrow, which I love all of these angles. It's like this really 360 angle, especially also, then in the tech fields too. Where do you personally feel most challenged or most alive in the space that you are in?
I'm challenged every day. We have a portfolio of 15 companies.
Oh, wow.
As you can imagine, they're kind of like little babies. So we have to look after them every day. I think one of the biggest challenges, for example, is the fact that around 85% of my founders come from outside of the fashion industry. As I said at the start, quite often as an outsider, we have this vision as to what it means to work in the fashion industry. So they approach us, okay, we want to work in the fashion industry. We have a new tech that we think is going to revolutionize industry. Quite often they are very quickly met with no's, barriers? How can I get my foot in the door?
Yeah.
So that is something that we have to overcome with them pretty much all the time. And I find that at all parts of the fashion value chain, whether that's design, the business strategy side of things, the product side of things, end of life, regardless of where you're trying to fit in the industry, most people find that as a challenge. And then where I feel most alive is when I'm able to see in my founders that moment, when they get that, basically. So it could be as simple as understanding how to talk to an industry insider, talking the fashion language. You said right at the start, we all love fashion, but quite often it's quite difficult with somebody from another industry then trying to speak to a fashion industry. It's like a duck and a chicken together, trying to come together. So those are those small wins, shall we say, that make my job and my team's job a little bit more meaningful. But yes, it can be challenging.
I can imagine that. But I really love how you're working with these really early stage founders and that you can give so much value to them through your own expertise. And are there any noticeable patterns for those who are building something when it really comes to their soul, not just the strategy?
Those noticeable patterns in terms of my founders, do you mean?
Yeah.
So I would say that most of the time they really want to enter the industry and they find the purpose as to why they want to enter the industry. So going back to your point about the soul, they find their soul quite quickly, shall we say. It's such, because as the industry is such an interesting problem to solve. Yeah. Literally amongst everything in the industry. So I think they find their soul quite quickly within their purpose. And I always ask all of the founders that we work with. So since launching in 2020, we've worked with over 200 founders now.
Wow.
Yeah, something like that. And I always ask them, what is your purpose? What is your why? And what is your guiding North Star to this adventure, to this journey? And when they find that, it's a quite nice thing to see. Of course, we have people that sometimes fail, quite often fail, and they don't find their purpose. Yeah. And I think that's part of the game with entrepreneurship. And they go on to do something else, which is obviously fine as well. But the ones that get it, they stick to it. And I'm probably sure but the industry of fashion is somewhere where you have to be very resilient. Yeah. And I always tell my founders, you have to be resilient to work in the industry.
Especially in the fashion industry, but I mean also from your angle then, especially also in tech, you have to be so resilient. Yeah. It's constant ups and downs and
Absolutely. I think the industry, they still a little bit lagging in terms of tech. For example, 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about luxury just then. They were pretty much the last ones to the table with e-commerce, with everything around selling to the customer. Yeah. Online. That's a really good classic example of how the industry may understand tech, they know that they need tech, but are they going to invest in tech and fashion? Quite often not. Yeah. I meet with many fashion brands, I won't say which ones, but they'll be like, we get the technology, we get what you're trying to do with your founders, but we won't be the first to invest. We won't be the first to put money behind this technology. We want to be like the third or the fourth. Yeah. Which obviously is going against what true innovation is about. And again, it's kind of like that just juxtaposition between, is fashion that innovative? When I hear answers like that, it does make me, second think, okay, maybe not as much. Yeah, 100%, especially if you're thinking, as you just said, these really like legacy fashion houses out there. I mean, to the point of that they were so late with e-commerce. Yeah. It's just really mind-blowing. And then we know that when the pandemic hit, people were shopping online and also they saw the spikes in e-commerce and in sales, which was then really backing up the idea of, hey, you also have to sell online. And if we think more about these legacy houses, what kind of technology do you think are they still really lacking at the moment? Oh, a lot.
A lot? Where do we begin?
Exactly, where do we begin? I would say what they do very well in is some of that flashier stuff, that end of the value chain, so retail, marketing, they do very well. Yeah. In, whether that is in an immersive digital campaign or whether that's a retail experience of some sort, that's something that I think they do very well. So let's just start with the good ones.
Good point.
I think something that they are lacking on is all of that upstream phase of fashion, I would say, it's being sold, but it's lagging behind the downstream phase, shall we say. So the downstream is everything post-production, so the marketing elements, retail that I just talked about. Everything upstream is about the design, product development, and the creation of the product, essentially. And I feel that there's a lot that's missing still there. For me as a designer, or a trained designer, I don't design anymore, I think there's a huge cultural barrier still there in terms of the creatives, the product developers needing to adopt the technologies. And just before we started hit record, we were talking about body sizing and so forth. I think that's a really good example of, why aren't the garment engineers using more technologies to help them to understand the human body
100%
a bit better? And if we solve that at the design phase, we're going to solve the fit issues, which will in turn mean less returns with e-commerce. And in some cases, that can be as high as 40% during the holiday periods. That's a huge number. Again, what does that mean? We can solve a lot of the overconsumption, overproduction issues. I always find it, incredible that the industry disposes, or not necessarily dispose, but around 30% of garments are unsold.
It's just
every year. And again, as the general consumer, you don't necessarily know that fact. Why would you? Or even realize? So I think if we can sort a lot of those issues out of the upstream phase, would be better. I think new materials, talking about circularity, sustainability. Some amazing innovations coming to the market, but it's a very long lead time. Between 10 and 15 years, shall we say, Rich, to commercialize a new material.
Wow.
That's very difficult for a new startup to keep on going, essentially. And they need that buy-in from the fashion brands to help them to come to fruition. Again, I think H&M Ventures, I love the work that they do, but quite often it's, again, a juxtaposition. We want to invest in new materials and we want to support you, but are we giving you enough orders? Quite often it's not the case.
I understand. I really love how you tapped on the value chain right now in the fashion industry. And before we started recording, I got a beautiful gift that I feel really, really excited about from you. So thank you so much for that, Peter. So Peter, you have this a really amazing book, Fashion Tech Applied. And in your book, you really explore how technologies like AI, NFTs, 3D design, and so much more that I will read into very soon. So with this beautiful book, what inspired you to write this? And how do you envision really the technologies to reshape the industry again?
Well, one of the questions that we always get asked, myself and the team, is what is fashion tech? And it's one of those, I guess, phrases that means something but nothing at the same time. It can mean literally an e-com store right through to the innovations that we were just talking about with circular fashion. And so why I wrote this book is to try to demystify what is that term in the first place, what is fashion tech, and how can technologies be applied to the fashion industry. I would say 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people thought fashion tech were, light up jackets and jackets with things that heat you up and keep you warm, or like amazing suits for artists to go on stage with. It's so much more than that. You touched upon this earlier. It's about all of those innovations that can actually plug into the system of fashion, all of those things that you can't see actually within the industry. I'm really unpacking all of that in the book and allowing, in very simple terms and very simple use cases, for the reader to understand, okay, the technology can do X, Y, Z, and this is how it's applied to the industry. So the book takes you through 6 chapters across the fashion value chain, right from design through to end of life, and what happens with the product when we are done with them, and just some use cases of technologies that go in there. It took a long time to write.
I can imagine. Do you want to share?
It took, so we got approached by this publisher in 2022 summer, springtime, May. We finished editing in October 23, and then the official launch of the book wasn't until January 24. So it was quite a long detail.
It's a long time, but there's so much wealth of knowledge in there, so it's definitely worth the wait. Peter, thank you so much for that. I'm really, I will. And also, if we're thinking about, we have your beautiful book, but then also the next generations of designers and technologists. If you think about them and if you look at them, what excites you about them?
Oh, a lot excites me. I love working with teams that have the two parts. So, i.e. fashion tech is two separate industries, actually. And when they come together in a founding team, I talked about earlier that moment. Yeah. Quite often, that's quite a nice thing to see when those two teams come together and create that moment together. In terms of technologies that are exciting, of course, AI is very busy at the moment, and I would exclamation that with a caveat, because we're seeing a lot of artificial intelligence solutions that are essentially wrappers around those base models. So the models that are created by people like OpenAI, for example. Yeah. And I get that. It makes sense because it's very then easy to understand. But what I try to say to my founders all the time is trying to create a technology that is proprietary to you and not just a wrapper like I'm just referring to. And so that's my caveat with AI. So we are working with some really good, interesting startups. So for example, one is T-Fashion in my portfolio. They are creating a trend forecasting platform based on AI powered. And essentially what the team is, the three genius founders, they come from AI, actually, so their PhDs are in AI. Wow. And so for me, that's quite exciting.
It is.
Because somebody from the fashion industry then trying to see something that's very technical and science-based, trying to come into the industry, which makes it super interesting. And they've essentially analysed over 50 million images, fashion images, over the last 9 years now, to be able to come up with an algorithm that can accurately forecast fashion trends up to 12 months in advance with 96% accuracy. Again, going back to our earlier points about how the industry is somewhat not as, shall we say, mindful of their practices.
Isn't. Yeah, it really isn't.
Something like T-Fashion as a solution can help to mitigate a lot of those problems, especially when it comes to overproduction. Paradoxically, is the problem with that is that the creators and the developers still have a reluctance with using a solution like T-Fashion because they were like, don't touch our creativity. We know what's coming up in the industry, which is fine. And we're not trying to say, you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, no.
We're trying to say, okay, how can you objectively back up your gut feeling, your experience, your knowledge with data, actually? And I think that's still very difficult for many creatives to overcome. Yeah. And if I'm being really honest, it took me a while to even come around to that type of thinking. Again, being trained at fashion school, you're not necessarily trained to look at designs or doing range plans backed by numbers. Yeah. And that is something that we need to overcome. And I think we are overcoming that slowly as an industry, but there's still a lot more work to be done.
That's true. I really love how you just talked about this mindset shift that you also had within yourself and in your own expertise and experience. And I know that you're somebody who really actively invests into fashion innovation. And if we're thinking about, this mindset shift, what model or mindset shift would you back right now with full confidence?
Oh,
it's tricky, I know.
A tricky question because there's so many exciting things happening. But I would say any innovation, and we talked about systems earlier, that can fundamentally rewire the systems that we've already built. So that could be linear. I'm not trying to say linear is, the devil within the fashion industry. There's a time and place for linear, but for example, if it's linear and then we can extend it past what we say as wastage or disposing of the product, whether that's resale. And of course, we saw a lot about e-commerce coming into fruition in the last 10 years. That's extended that linear model by so much more. Yeah. In terms of value, in terms of economic value, in terms of usage, in terms of the joy for the customer. Yes. Of course, we can't forget the customer in this equation is super important. But for us at Beyond Form, there's a few areas that we are quite excited. So one of them is re-commerce, rental, repair, anything to do with giving new life to the product is an exciting space. And that's going to explode even further over the next 10 years in terms of market growth. So I think that's quite exciting. The next thing that I think is super exciting is digital showcasing.
Oh, yeah.
Whether that's immersive worlds, virtual worlds. I was reading this week how Zebeto is launching branded fashion stores within their virtual world. I think is super interesting.
It is.
I think that conversation between gaming and fashion is only beginning. And if we're thinking of a platform like Roblox, which has, millions of active users every single day, is an untapped opportunity, I would say, for a lot of fashion brands as well. We talked about earlier e-commerce, is that how can we even augment that even further, whether that's immersive shopping experiences. I know that obviously things like the Apple Vision headset is not accessible to a lot of people.
No.
So there's a huge parity still with technology. But when it does become a little bit more accessible to the everyday consumer, I think like shopping online through different formats, through different mediums in a different space is going to be quite exciting. And how can we then merge those worlds between the physical and the digital? And this is something that we looked actually before Beyond Form came to life. I had like Beyond Form version 1.0 show in London, and we were looking at how do those worlds come together. And it's very interesting to see how we've come such a long way in terms of just the way we shop, essentially. Of course, we still want products on our fingertips. We'll never get around that, and hence why digital fashion hasn't come to life that I think most fashion companies would hope to have seen, because we can never remove physical products from the equation. But I think digital showcasing in some ways is very exciting. And then the final one is smart retail. So how can we, we talked about luxury there earlier in the conversation. How can we make the conversation between the fashion brand, the retail environment, and then the consumer even stronger, even in a more seamless way? In some ways, I do think in places like China, where they are a little bit more advanced with social commerce, shall we say? Absolutely.
I'm such a fan, to be honest.
Yeah.
I've led some live selling activations, and it is such a beautiful tool. You are directly with the consumer. And if you think about e-commerce shopping, it is not the most beautiful experience. You can't touch the fabrics. You can't really ask that much questions. You don't get really insights into sizing and fitting. But through this really live commerce, it's all changing because you have knowledgeable hosts in there that can, at the moment, really answer your questions. So I really see, honestly, live commerce as a big tool to really reduce also returns, but also level up the customer satisfaction.
Absolutely. And that is only just one example of where smart retail can really make a difference. When we talk about AI, I know I talked about that earlier again, is how did those all come together in a very invisible way, which is also super important. And I can't remember who it was, but there was somebody that was talking about AI, and they were saying, if you can physically see AI happening in real time, or that it's there, AI has done a bad job, essentially. Technology is supposed to be just there in your life, in the background, just doing whatever it needs to do. And you as the human just go living your daily life without knowing that it's there. And I think when we talk about innovations, we call those, those innovation phantoms, essentially, where you think you have a winner, but in practice, not really. And there are many examples of that at the moment within retail.
Absolutely. I really love how you talked about the systems, within the industry. And I know you have helped and shifted by yourself so many projects and the systems within the industry, and you launched so much and ideas that you've planted into the industry. So is there like one moment within your career that you really feel that still resonates with you as really the legacy marker that you are?
Oh, there's like so many things.
I believe so.
But I think with the industry itself? Do you want a specific project?
Honestly, just where you right now feel that was a wow moment for you.
Okay, so I think for me, it's being able to sit at a table with C-level executives and be like, okay, here's my portfolio, here are my founders. If you agree whether they're going to work or not is something else, but at least take it seriously in terms of a conversational piece. And we are now being able to do that with the big fashion brands, which I think is super important for that innovation work, that early stage venture work that we're doing as well for entrepreneurship is super important. One thing that I hope the industry does get over, though, is their lip service element. The industry at the moment is still, on average, spending less than 2% of their revenues back into innovation work, which is super tiny.
It is.
So, although we're having conversations, we still need to get over that conversational element. And some of my founders have spent, for example, 12, 24 months, 36 months educating these C-level executives as to why technology or how technology can improve those core business units.
Absolutely. So would you say or think that this is something that you personally also want to leave within the industry as a legacy behind? That there's not so much education that has to happen with these executives? Is your heart somewhere else where you say, like, this is the legacy I want to leave behind in the industry?
I hope for the executives that they get over some of their biases, but I don't think that's what I want to leave. That's a them problem, not a me problem. But I think for me, it's about, and the reason why I wrote the book is fashion and technology is no longer a novelty sector, but actually it's something that can be taken seriously. It's part of the everyday lexicon of a fashion executive, of a fashion brand. And it's not just lights in a jacket, essentially.
It's very impactful. So I feel that. Peter, you are really interesting. I could sit here for hours with you and, talk and really see also, where all your expertise also in tech comes in and plays within the field of fashion. It's so cool. And I really can't wait to read into your book. I will come back with so many questions, and I hope we can have a part 2 somewhere.
Absolutely. Part 2, we can dismantle the fashion industry even more.
Right? One couch at a time.
Exactly.
Fashion industry dismantled.
Exactly.
And Peter, since we are unfortunately coming to the end, where can people find you if they want to connect, if they want to learn more about you?
So our website, beyondform.io, has all the information for fashion brands, entrepreneurs, designers, students as well that want to get into the industry, fashion and technology. So there's a lot of information on there. And of course, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well.
Absolutely. I will definitely put all of Peter's information into the show notes so everybody can reach you. And Peter, thank you so much for being part of this beautiful podcast here in Paris. And I hope to see you very soon again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.